Hello and welcome to my channel. I'm Tiffany, a retired librarian to homeschool mom, and in this video I'm going to cover the children's book Hidden Figures. So this is the children's book, not to be confused with what I would consider more of the adult book. The author is the same. The author is Margot Lee Shetterly. She was assisted by Winifred Conkling, and the illustrator is Laura Freeman. So Shetterly wrote the original Hidden Figures. She knew most of the women that are mentioned in this book, and obviously in the longer book, she grew up with them. She did not have a clue who they were, at least in the sense of their contributions to science and aeronautics and the space program. So she found that out as an adult when talking to her parents when she came home after she was an adult. She was married, she had a career, and she still had no clue. I do believe Dorothy Vaughan was her Sunday school teacher. So it was very much a, what? She did, my Sunday school teacher did what? She was, yeah. It was, I think, very shocked. And it inspired her to write that book. And she got a grant to cover, I believe, women in science. Yeah, the back of the book says, yeah. She got an Alfred P. Sloan Foundation Fellow and the recipient of the Virginia Foundation of Humanities grant for her research into the history of women in computing. So she, and there, oh, do a picture here. There's the author up in the top, and then the illustrator, Laura Freeman. She, let's see, she worked in fashion houses, and yeah, she's basically become a children's book illustrator. She lives in Atlanta. Shetterly looks like she lives in Charlottesville, Virginia, so she went back to Virginia. I think in the original book she was living in either Mexico or New Mexico, and I have to go back and look when she found out this information. It's also a Coretta Scott King Award winner. So this book is very much a shortened, brief summary of the much, much longer, far more detailed Hidden Figures book, because obviously this is meant for kids. So it does cover the three same women that are the major players in the book that she covers. Dorothy Vaughan is the first and the one I remember the most because the book has 10 chapters on it, her in the very beginning. So, but it does cover Dorothy Vaughan, Mary Jackson, Katherine Johnson, and Kristen Darden. Kristen Darden's the youngest of the group. She didn't start at NASA until the 60s, and I know the least about her. So the book starts and does kind of, it talks about the war, because that's where it starts with. It starts with Dorothy Vaughan, who started at the Langley Research Center back in the 40s, working as a human computer on the West End computer during segregation. So it mentions all the segregation, how, I mean, most people know it. Blacks and whites were completely separate. Everything was different. You had separate bathrooms. The women of the West computers were the only professional women who, African-American women who were working at Langley. So they had a separate lunch table. Everybody else could do whatever they want. That obviously, that changed. There's an entire chapter of them talking about the sign there. It's kind of funny in the original book. So it talks about that. It does mention the separate table at the lunchrooms, which is, again, I'll talk about that. It's one of the stories I remember from the original book. But it talks about Dorothy staying on after the war and starting to work on the space program. So she was working not for NASA, but she was working for the precursor, which is, I believe, the research center here. To look back, my brain is NACA, the National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics. So, and that was the precursor to NASA. So that's who the first three women were originally working for before NASA kind of took over. So the first part of the book kind of covers Dorothy in the beginning and how she was a human computer during the war and stayed on after the war ended, working with the space program. And then it goes on to be talking about Mary Jackson, who, she was a computer originally. She worked under Vaughan, if I remember correctly, from the original book. She ended up working in the wind tunnels. And there's a whole nother story. If you have only seen the film, the whole bathroom situation, the closest thing that actually happened in real life actually happened to Mary Jackson and not Katherine Johnson. But so this kind of covers her story. It covers her fighting going to court in order to take higher end math classes that were taught at the high school in Newport News, West Virginia, or I believe around, which is where Langley is situated. So, and she eventually got permission. I believe they ended up taking night classes, and that's kind of how they compromised there. So she ended up becoming the first African American female engineer at that laboratory. Then the story goes on to talk to about Katherine Johnson. She started there in 1953. She was, again, a computer, but she ended up working in trajectories. So when it comes to the space program and rockets, determining, okay, it's shooting off here, where the heck is it going to land, which is very, very important when you're sending people into space. She also fought to be in on some of their meetings where they're talking about what's going on, rather than just kind of sitting there and being given assignments. And eventually got her name on one of the reports. Now there's a far more detailed story in the much larger book of how her name ended up being on one of the reports that went out, which were essentially almost academic papers to an extent. It's called, basically, it was signifying, yes, she did most of this work. And then it jumps back, and the other book does this as well, where it comes to talking about Dorothy, where she realizes with the incoming the non-human computers, that her and a lot of the other women, their jobs when they were still in the computing pool were going to be defunct. So she taught herself computer language, and then she taught and got all the other women that were still under her in the computing pool to learn this computer language to basically save their jobs. So they knew how to make the mechanical computers work. So they were able to move on to different locations within the laboratory and stay employed when both the two computing pools, both the East and West, white and black, were essentially disbanded because they weren't needed anymore. So it talks a little bit about that. Then it goes into a little bit more of the history of the space program, which again the book does quite a bit as well. It talks very much about the space program and how that works. And then jumps back to Katherine Johnson, and this is one of my favorite stories, both in this book and in the big book. So John Glenn, who's the guy they first shot into space, and for some reason I believe he convinced them to send him into space again. This was the old guy who got himself sent into space. But back when he was still a young guy, when they were doing this original space program, he didn't trust the computers. So he trusted Katherine Johnson to check the numbers when he was doing his first space flight. So he basically said, I don't trust these numbers about basically my trajectory of where I'm going to land. I want her to check the numbers. If she agrees with the numbers, I'm good to go. And that happened. And she double-checked the numbers, and she's like, yep, this is where he's going to land. And that's how he chose to go into space. He wanted to trust a human being, not a mechanical computer, in order to make sure where he landed so they could pick him up, because otherwise he probably would have been stuck at sea, because that's the way it worked back then. They had capsules. They were shot off in a rocket, and when they came back, they landed in the ocean. So it then goes on to cover a little bit more of the how things changed, the 50s, the 60s, the civil rights movement happened. And then it talks just a little bit about Kristen Darden, who was very, very good at math. And she became an engineer for the supersonic airplanes, and basically planes that fly at the faster than the speed of sound, and became an expert. And then she did help NASA's mission to the moon. So then it talks a little bit about the moon landing and how these women were involved. Now, if you've only seen the film, it shows them in the control center. No, all of these women, as far as I know, stayed at Langley. Particularly the older women. They had children, they had family, they had community, they weren't going anywhere. I do believe that they asked some of them to, particularly Katherine Johnson, and she said no. Because again, she was married, she had kids, she wasn't gonna move her family across the country. She was happy at Langley. So, and that's pretty much it. It does cover what I think is great. It does a little bit of a timeline here. about NASA history and the women history. So Vaughan started at the NACA in 43. Mary Johnson started there in 51, and then Katherine Johnson came along in 1953. And then it changed in 58. So it changed to NASA in 1958, and Kristen Darden came along in 1967. So like I said, she was the youngest of the four. And then it does give a bit of a biography. So you see the first two here, and then the last two, the younger two, at the end there. And then gives a little bit more of a glossary. So it does give a little bit of author's note where she talks about the original Hidden Figures book, and when she knew these women. And I think it's an amazing story. Both this book and the original Hidden Figures, which is the much, much longer, far more detailed book, and this is are great stories. This is a brief window into the lives of these four amazing women and into NASA aeronautical history. And that's the big thing to remember, both with this book and particularly with the longer book, is not only is this a look into the lives of these women, but the longer book goes into detail about NASA history. It's very much a mixture of a biography along with a historical account of the growing of aeronautics and space flight and rocket science back in that beginnings between the 40s and the 60s, and possibly I think a little bit into the 70s. But also a major introduction to these amazing, amazing women who did amazing things and didn't really take a lot of recognition for it, which is the reason the books are called Hidden Figures. The author grew up in the shadow of Langley and knew these women. They were part of her community, and she didn't know because they never talked about it, because they did work that they loved. These women were scientists and mathematicians. They were very, very good. I remember, I think I mentioned that there was a quote I'm summarizing here from Katherine Johnson talking about Dorothy Vaughan, and said she was the smartest of all of us. And she actually ended up stuck briefly because she became a supervisor, and so a lot of the other women below her were able to move on to different projects, and she was stuck in the computing pool until near the end. And then she taught herself a computer language in the very beginning of computer languages. So there are amazing stories about some amazing women in history. This book is a great introduction if you're looking for a book on as part of doing, some people do unit studies on African American history, on NASA history. This is a great book. Again, this is a fantastic book. It has great illustrations. It's very engaging. It does have a refrain to it to connect things, which I believe is basically saying they were good at math, really good, or really, really good, because all of these women were fantastic at mathematics. I mean, the first three were literally human computers. They were doing calculations, some of it in their heads, some of it machines. They were doing stuff that we use computers to do now by hand with simple calculation machines. A lot of them graduated from high school very young. I believe Katherine Johnson was like 15. Dorothy Vaughan probably wasn't much older than that. So they were very, very good at what they did, and they loved what they did. And they didn't really take a lot of recognition for it. I think Katherine Johnson's the only one who got a Medal of Honor for her work. I could be wrong, but all of them did fantastic work. Without them, we may have not gone to the moon. Who knows? They were vital to this, and they're a great story. I will cover the full book, not in great detail. I'm dyslexic. I've read it twice, but a lot of the science and the mathematics stuff goes way over my head. I did not do good in math. My husband's really good at it. He's a big math person. I had crappy teachers, and the public school system pushed me far too fast, so I was never able to fall in love with it like I think I might have the ability to do. Not to mention I'm dyslexic and my brain kind of works funny. I get distracted a little easy. Maybe ADHD, don't know. I've never bothered to check when it comes to that. I doubt it's the full thing. But it's a great book. This is a great introduction. The longer book I'll do a review of. Like I said, give a brief review. I recommend both. If you have younger elementary school kids, this is a great introduction. If you have older, if your mom is interested, if the teachers are interested, mom, whoever's teaching the kids, read the adult book. You can probably help with a little bit talking to the kids a little bit more about the stories in NASA history as well. If you have, I think the youngest, depending on the reading, I would recommend, and I'll mention this when I do the adult review, would be probably middle school if they're really, really good at reading and they have a really good attention span, because it's a very long, very detailed book. This is a great introduction. I'm going to look for other books about these individual people. I do have a review on 2 books on Katherine Johnson. That's already out. I believe that's Counting on Katherine, and I can't remember the exact title of the other one. They both really kind of focus on math. So that is a different review. If you like this review, want to see more of my book reviews, some of my homeschooling stuff, I will eventually do some travel stuff. I'm big on STEM books, and lit books and kind of stuff that's out of the box. So please, if you're interested in more of kind of my opinion and some out of the box and STEM focused and even cultural book reviews, check out the rest of my book reviews, like and subscribe. And that is it for this review. Again, big shooting out for Hidden Figures, fantastic, both books. The film I will cover. I will do that. That's problematic. It's very problematic, but I will cover it anyway because that's the thing most people know. But read both these books if you can. Great introductions. But again, that is it for this review. Thank you.